Greetings, everyone. Today, our speaker is Sister Mumbi, and her topic for today is intercultural living and the future of religious life. You have her picture and her bio, and you know information about her. So at this time, I present to you Sister Mumbi. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Michelle. So as a Black African sister in an American congregation and the first one to join it, I think intercultural living is something that is very personal to me, having been the first one kind of to venture into a predominantly white community. And at the time I came in, it had become something that we talked about a lot in religious spaces. Intercultural living, how do we do it, and how do we do it best? And I can say it has become a focus in religious life. And it makes sense why, because after a long time in religious life where life was about conformity and uniformity, we are now living at a time where we want to embrace the whole person and realizing that our differences are gifts. However, I think it's very important to take a moment and ask, what are we trying to achieve in living interculturality? And what does success look like? Even so, we need to acknowledge that in seemingly homogeneous setups, subcultures exist. And in the context of religious life, another culture has always emerged based on common practices and shared history, etc. However, with migration, many more American communities are now welcoming new members who come from completely different societal, national, and racial backgrounds. And this is not just an American phenomenon, even though this is the context within which I am based. In Africa, I've seen more and more West Africans joining communities in East Africa or Southern Africa and vice versa. And many international communities that traditionally had different houses of formation that took candidates from their immediate geographical areas are now opting to have international vitiates where all new members come together and are also formed by sisters from different cultural backgrounds. However, from my perspective, I think it's impossible to tackle the issue of interculturality when looking at culture from a much wider sense without examining our own biases and prejudices, including racism. In a world of rising nationalistic politics and sentiments, where we're witnessing rising tribalism, xenophobia, and ethnocentrism, we need to be very honest about what holds us back from also living out interculturality within our own communities. The influence of the wider world on religious life, and thus our own thoughts and sentiments and choices, cannot be ignored or dismissed. Doing so will be perilous, as witnessed during sad historical events such as the Jim Crow era, when religious congregations barred Black women from joining their congregations in the US, or during the Rwandan genocide, when even clergy and religious were involved in violent and criminal acts against one another and others based on tribe. Having thought long and hard about the future of religious life, which is another hot button topic in the global north amongst religious communities, the context here in the north is usually about the declining numbers of sisters within congregations and the whole, the higher median ages of the members, and fewer women joining religious life. In the global south, when we talk about the future, the issue is pertaining to the growing poverty and the rising cost of living. It also comes about as many communities realize that it's time for a renewal, a holistic renewal, re-examining their way of life, formation, leadership, how you discern ministry, but also in reviewing their ministerial commitments. I always say that the global south, not necessarily as a bad thing, but as many religious communities in the West began as social workers, providing healthcare, providing education. In Africa, for instance, these social services are still predominantly provided by the Catholic Church, and thus many sisters are involved in those things. However, there are rising needs, and how do you sustain these ministries with growing poverty? How do you sustain the sisters themselves with their own needs in terms of educating newer members, providing for the elderly now as those numbers also start rising in this part of the world? However, I see a few things that are gifts from this desire and attempts to live interculturality. And one of them is indigenous practices. You know, I often joke that many people view indigenous practices as primitive until a famous person in Hollywood takes it up, and then it becomes the cool, exotic thing to do, you know, like yoga, etc. And then the discovery of this practice is attributed to this famous person, and suddenly it is all the rage, you know?
Mhm.
When I think of my own congregation, reconciliation is part of our charism and spirituality. And I do some work in that area. A lot of the tools that I've found that help me come from indigenous communities around the world. And more so, when I've reflected on them, they are low cost approaches, meaning they can be offered to many more people at minimal costs. So I ask religious communities, what can we tap into from indigenous practices of some of your newer members or the surrounding communities or the communities that we have traditionally ministered to? Can we involve them and ask them what it is that you practice that can be done and can be done at the local level? I think interculturality also is a counter witness, the very ability to live and work together in love as members of different cultures offers a very different way in an increasingly divided world. Without denying any member's identity or upholding one culture over the other, what does it look like to live together motivated by gospel values, motivated and inspired by love? Of course, a practice of love that is not all fleety, but that embodies constant forgiveness and openness to continuous dialogue, a re-examination of one's own biases, but most of all, a generosity of heart with one another and lots of patience. I think interculturality translates into a richer and fuller life. I know my own life has been made so much better, and my worldview has been enhanced by all the various things I've learned from all the cultures I've been immersed in or I've happened to live alongside. From food to literature, music, dance, styles of prayer, perspectives, and wisdom, people venture beyond their own backyards, either literally or figuratively. Migration is a huge gift to us. Before, you would have to look for money and travel to be able to learn or meet people from different cultures. It's a cliche, but truly the world has become a global village. We only need to take a step out of our own communities and meet somebody from a different place, a different background, somebody of a different race, a different nationality. And then through communication and being open to dialogue, there's so much to learn and garner from that. I think of Chicago, where I live. Chicago has all these ethnic neighborhoods. In 1 week, I could eat food from different parts of the world every
Mhm.
single day. And even in my own neighborhood, which is predominantly what we say Hispanic, which is people who speak Spanish, mainly from Central and South America, just amongst them are people from like 7 different countries. So there's something to learn from each of those places. And I could go on and on about the gifts. And I think at this point, it's important to invite people to think of outside of touristic activities where we go into other places wanting to see the best of those cultures, you know. We go to the Caribbean to enjoy the beautiful sea and the beaches, you know, and the great weather. What does it mean when we truly look at the other as equal and created in the image of God and sit at their feet and learn? As religious women, we are doers, and it's a wonderful thing because we have changed lives and communities all over the place by doing. However, in that doing business, sometimes we have taken on power by the virtual position of us being the givers of help, the givers of education, the givers of healthcare. What does it mean when we sit back and accept? You know, hospitality is a two-sided coin. But many times when we think of hospitality, we think of offering beverage to the weary person who comes in the door. And we think of all these things. We think of, good thirsty and washing the other's feet. How hard is it in religious houses sometimes to find volunteers to allow their feet to be washed? Because we are so used to giving, but we are not used to taking. And in taking, this is the gift of religious life. It's a gift of interculturality, to take in from other cultures, to take in and use this to help other people, to take in and be nourished ourselves in accepting that we are also wounded people. However, I would be remiss if I didn't share my musings about another aspect of the future of religious life that I've often thought about with some of my friends and community members. Safety and security is a very basic human need. And I also add there the desire to have order in one's life. It's very hard to live with uncertainty, not knowing what will happen tomorrow, you know. So we create order, we plan ahead. However, I don't know about you, Michelle, but my own faith journey has been a constant invitation to trust and let go. Constantly trust and let go. And when I succeed, and I have to admit it's not often that I succeed, the blessings are numerous. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But instinctual as a human being, I go back again to wanting to control, wanting to be sure of the outcome, wanting safety and security. Looking at the history of humanity, looking at our own stories of our founders and the initial members of our community, people lived in this reality of having to let go and trust, perhaps not by choice, but because of the circumstances. Many people around the world, more than 50%, live in that reality today because of a lack of resources. So there's a privilege in being able to have safety and security and to be able to plan. A lot of our congregations, through hard work and wisdom, and sometimes by God's generosity, are very safe and secure. We have a privilege. And sometimes this privilege is a barrier to us embracing the other, embracing the uncertainty of letting go. When we talk of interculturality, it is literally a process of letting go of our safety nets, what I've known to be true, what I've known to be right, what I've known to be the best way. In a broader sense for our congregation, it is also letting go of our safety nets in form of institutions, policies, and procedures that even though they all started out with the best of intentions, no longer serve their purpose and actually are now barriers to us living out our vocational calls. I've often thought that the call of the now for religious communities is to be itinerant, to go where the need is. And going where the need is, cultural living. Pope Francis constantly reminds us that we are a church for the poor and of the poor, and we should be that. It is wonderful to be able to give resources to organizations working at the grassroots. It is wonderful to be able to start nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations amongst the poor. But what does it mean for us to literally step in and live with the poor, to embrace poverty that we vow as an intercultural experience? And I'm not only talking about material poverty. It is that thing that you're uncomfortable about stepping into as a religious. What does it mean for religious women now who can be connected in so many different ways to free themselves and ask themselves, where are my skills and gifts and abilities most at this time? And how quickly can we make it possible for members of our communities who desire to live this out to move into those situations? I find there are parallels in this. When I have encountered aspects about other cultures that hold me back or that make me take pause and think, no, I don't want to do it that way, or make me even think, oh no, my own way is better. I feel these same pauses are what religious congregations as a whole experience. So intercultural living calls for brutal honesty with ourselves. I'm not trying to criticize American religious life at this point, but I've constantly said that one thing that drives me crazy is wordsmithing. It happens a lot in our meetings as we try to craft documents. We wordsmith and we say, no, this is not the right way to refer, for instance, to the poor. Do we call them the poor, the vulnerable, or those who are marginalized or on the margins? These words have changed with time. I always think from the perspective of the poor, being with them would worry less about what to call them because they would then be our sisters and brothers, our siblings. And for a person who hasn't had 3 square meals for a long time, what we do in our spaces of thought, of thinking, of structure, of planning doesn't matter much. To that person, a guarantee to have 3 square meals a day would matter more. So, is it possible? I'm going to take a commercial break for a second and switch off that. I'm very sorry to whoever is watching this for that.
That's right. That's right.
So, what would it mean to do more and talk, think less? I'm not saying pray less. There's a difference between discernment of what God is inviting you to. However, how many times do we coach our inaction under discernment? So interculturality, community-wide, congregational-wide, calls for brutal honesty. What things as a congregation, what things as groups of religious sisters, what things in our history hold us back from moving into interculturality? And I will share some of the experiences I've had as I've talked with religious communities who are now welcoming new members from other cultures. And when you ask the question of how come you did not have women of color in your congregation before, post Jim Crow, when it was no longer an American issue as such, where the laws no longer prohibited people of color and white people from being together. And many times I hear it was too hard, or nobody applied, or they came and they didn't stay. If we don't address these problems authentically and honestly, they will still not come and stay.
Yeah.
And if we don't address these problems honestly, then our ministry is not also effective. It is kind of a paradox that we would have communities serving communities of color, but they don't have members of color in their own ranks. It shows we want to give hospitality, but we refuse to receive it. In America, the growing demographic of Catholics comes from Latin America. How many congregations can count members of Latin America amongst their ranks? We now have the second and third generation of them living in the US. Another huge demographic are Vietnamese American Catholics who came over years ago, second generation, third generation Vietnamese Americans. How come they are not members of religious congregations? Yet we see the Catholic communities of Vietnamese Americans keeps growing. What do we need to change? And it is critical. What do we need to let go of? And horror stories abound of certain members of such communities moving into communities, and everything about their way of life is criticized. Their food is strange, the smell of their food is not approved of, small adjustments to prayer cannot be made. All these things are frowned upon as being the wrong way to live religious life. And I go back to the point I was making. We cannot dismiss the influence of the wider culture on religious life. So at a time where we just went through a horrific experience that is now being tried in court of the January 6th insurrection, the constant phrase I've heard is, this cannot be America. This is not the America I know. Where did all these people come from? In the same vein, I've had a few sisters who are open enough to admit to me, you probably would not be welcome in some of our relatives' homes because they hold these political sentiments. My question is always, do you challenge these political sentiments or these ideological beliefs? And many people say, I choose peace. I choose not to be estranged from my community, from my family members, from my community members. So what does that mean? Does me, imagine me as a white American whose family holds these views. I work in a predominantly Black community. Does what I do with this community erase the fact that I don't challenge my family members? Does my good cancel the bad? And so when I think of the future, when I think of all the things that create my culture, that means my family of origin and how I was socialized, my educational level, my economic status, my sexual orientation, the power and privilege I possess in this strange hierarchy of humanity, which is a reality. When I think of all these things, then we cannot tackle interculturality in religious life without acknowledging all these things that shape who I am. And so, since I do not separate myself from my family when I come into religious life, or my social economic background, or my educational level, our conversations cannot exist in silos as religious congregations. We have to embrace the whole of that human being. And we need to create spaces where honest conversations can take place, where I can say, yes, I grew up with this idea and this knowledge about this kind of people. And this should be taken into consideration when you are sending me or asking me to go work in a certain place. What knowledge is needed? What knowledge is needed in religious life? What knowledge needs to be inculcated information to ensure that I'm constantly aware of my biases and prejudices, that I'm not causing harm no matter how much good I'm trying to do. I believe another future of religious life is that we need to first look beyond our resources. Our ability to provide and give then helps us ignore a multitude of sins and sometimes causes more harm. There's this popular saying that people never forget how you made them feel. They can forget so many other things, what you did for them, but not how you made them feel. When I think of Africa, um, and I think sometimes of the harm brought about by colonial missionary activity, and I say this very deliberately, that the separation between the missionaries and the colonial masters could not be told apart in many ways. When I think of the harm, which is internal, it is emotional, it is mental trauma, it is poor theology. And I think of the good that they brought, because I am a product of missionary education. I would not have enjoyed that missionary education if some people had not come here years before and formed a local congregation of sisters who then educated me. However, I see in my own family generations of trauma being passed on out of internalized colonial behavior.
Mm-hmm.
A countercultural witness is we attending to the emotional and mental needs of populations in as much as we're providing for their material and physical needs. That whichever program, whichever activity we choose to do in a community of needs to be holistic. This is the intercultural way of living. Not to come in with solutions, to come in and listen, to come in and understand, but to also come in and make reparations, because many of us represent decades of harm done by the institutional church, done by religious women, done by our own congregations in many areas that we live. Brutal honesty. This is my constant refrain. I go back to the last thing that undermines intercultural living is individualism. It is not an American phenomenon. Many ways, I think it's a religious life phenomenon, individualistic behavior. We came in, women of all kinds of backgrounds, drawn by a charisma and spirituality. When we are honest, we acknowledge that perhaps this would not be my circle of friends or community if not for the charisma and spirituality. And even in communities that are so heavy on uniformity and conformity, individuals always strive to be unique. Your personality is like this thing that constantly bugs you. It wants to stand out. Having been in a congregation that was what we could say a bit more traditional, that wore a habit before, it came out in interesting ways. It came out in having a different coffee mug that was uniquely yours. You know, it came out in wanting to have a bedspread that was different from the others, because this is human nature. God created us this way with all this diversity in appearance and etc. So trying to stamp it out is almost impossible. But when does our individuality become a barrier? It becomes a barrier where intercultural living, we look at it as tolerance. Not an acceptance or an embrace, but I tolerate it. Oh, I live with Michelle. She can have her meat and potatoes every day. I'll go into the kitchen and make something that is Kenyan or Kikuyu. We are living together, and I'll tell you bon appetit before you eat. But I look at your plate, you're eating something different. I look at my plate, I'm eating something different. It's our time to lead prayer. I will go in, I'll play a song. It will be a song in Swahili. I'll be like, oh, Michelle tells me, oh, I love that tune. It's very, Michelle, you will play something. I'll be like, oh, I like that tune. Nobody is learning from the other. Nobody is trying out the other's culture, but we are living in an atmosphere of tolerance. So, how do we counter this? How do we do intercultural when our idea of intercultural is tolerance? And Michelle, you'll probably be my biggest ally because if another sister moves into our community and she's like, oh, I don't like when Mumbi cooks this or that. And you'll be like, no, you have to let her do her thing. We're intercultural. And this is a big challenge because it is, let me do my thing, I will let you do your thing, but we are not learning or growing from each other's experiences. Again, honesty is needed in these situations. What stops you from trying what I like, and what stops me from trying what you like? Anybody coming to visit us and live with us for 2 days is not going to be moved by our intercultural witness because it doesn't exist. And is there true love in those situations? I always compare, and it's a wrong comparison, religious life to people who are falling in love. When people are falling in love, you want to try everything the other person does. Mumbi, who's not a team player, you'll see me now playing soccer or trying to play soccer, and I'm not great with team sports because I'm always scared somebody's going to hurt me really badly. Falling in love, we risk it all. Can we as religious learn to risk it all for the gospel of Jesus? Because in the end, intercultural living is about living gospel values. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Mumbi. You have given us a lot to think about. Particularly, you've challenged us in our willingness to be open to others, to have that sense of humility that where we can embrace others, especially with that last um, um, point that you made in relationship to tolerance or embracing. But also, you've challenged us with understanding our own background and our own cultural upbringing and how that influences us as we relate to others. So, thank you. Thank you for your input today, and we appreciate it. And that ends our presentation for today. Thank you.